Should I press it? Trevor asked, his finger hovering just an inch away from the button. I don't know. Yes? No? Maybe? I was shivering too hard to think straight. I mean, what choice do we have? It's freezing out here. Fine, do it, I said. Click. Before losing hope. But what if it doesn't work? Ding. It works, Trevor said with a smile. Suddenly, the elevator's doors opened. I took a step back to survey the rusty contraption, its exterior significantly weathered by the elements, as if I knew anything about the structural integrity of elevators or had any other choice but to step in. I stepped in. Going up? Trevor asked, doing his best bellhop impression. Slam. As the doors closed behind us. I was much too cold to find the humor in Trevor's joke, but then I realized he was being serious. Wait, you're not thinking of taking this thing all the way up, are you? I thought we were just going to use it for shelter tonight. I looked over at the panel of buttons on the inside of the elevator. Besides one for open and one for close, there were only two others, each labeled with their destinations. Base, where we presumably entered, and summit, where I feared we'd be going. Click. I was right. Hey, why'd you do that? We didn't agree to go up there, I began to say before Trevor interrupted me. I'm not sleeping in the cold again, he said defiantly. It'll be warm up there, and if we're lucky, we'll find help. I couldn't argue with him. It had been almost 2 full days since we had somehow managed to veer off the hiking trail and ended up lost in the foothills of the mountains. Night 1 was cold, to say the least. As we continued our slow ascent to the summit, my mind began to race. Idiot, how did you manage to follow the signage and still get us lost? And what were you thinking, suggesting a hike in the first place? Trevor doesn't even like nature. I was still beating myself up over the idea. Trevor had been my best friend since elementary school, and I had surprised him with what I hoped would be a respite from the stresses of his life. In hindsight, I realized it was probably a respite from my own. But I reminded myself that I was also the one who suggested climbing up higher, to get us a better vantage point, and, as a result, it was I who discovered the elevator. I remember spotting it for the first time, illuminated by the sunset, and not believing my eyes. Like a mirage in the desert, an elevator built into the foothills of a mountain, of all places. Of course, I was glad we had found it, but its existence still bothered me. But why? And to where? Ding! Suddenly, I was jarred from my ruminations as the elevator's doors opened into darkness. Trevor simply looked at me and put a finger over his mouth. Shh! Before stepping out, I followed. Slam. The door shut behind us. We stood there in darkness for a moment, our eyes slowly adjusting to the lack of light, until something came into view. There's a light up ahead, I whispered, pointing down a rocky passage that I assumed must have been a mining tunnel or something at one point in time. We followed it for a while until the light grew brighter and we arrived at a room lit by torches. Looking around, I noticed 4 other tunnels leading out of the room, besides the one we had entered from. What do you think this place is? Trevor asked. Maybe... But before I could continue, I spotted something in the shadows. I tiptoed over quietly to investigate it as Trevor stared at me, confused. Looking down at the rocky floor, I saw a hooded man wearing a tattered brown robe, clenching his leg and writhing in pain. He noticed me right away and, clearly fatigued, began mumbling something softly, extending his arm for help. I picked up a few of his words, but after listening for a minute, it became apparent that whatever he was speaking wasn't exactly English, but rather some sort of English dialect so far removed from it that it was incomprehensible. "Let's leave him be and keep going," Trevor suggested. "He's not our problem." "Are you serious?" I shot back. "We're literally here looking for help, and you're not going to help this man? Looks like he broke his leg. We have to bring him to wherever he's from." Eventually, my best friend reluctantly agreed. And so, Trevor and I crouched down, picked up the injured man, and carried him off into one of the dark tunnels, unsure of where exactly we were going. We must have walked in the dark for at least 10 minutes, starting and stopping frequently to readjust his weight in our arms, before we finally reached what awaited us at the end of the passage. My jaw dropped. There before us was a gargantuan cave, stalactites hanging from the ceiling and all. A cave so massive that we could barely see the other side. What we could see, though, was a platform at its center, separating us by a decrepit wooden bridge. And on that rocky island must have been 100 hooded individuals, dressed exactly like our wounded friend, all gathered around what looked like a very long table. Trevor looked at me and smiled, as if to say, "We're saved." But that's when things got weird. Spotting us carrying one of their people, a couple of the hooded strangers came running across the bridge and, noticing the man's injury, bowed to us in what I would assume was a gesture of thanks. They then mumbled a few words in the same mysterious language as the injured man before picking him up and scurrying back over the bridge. When they reached the other side, they waved us over excitedly, encouraging us to cross it and join them for what appeared to be dinner, as we could see plates and utensils laid out across the table. Having now gone over 48 hours without eating, we had little choice but to accept their invitation. When we arrived at the platform, we were greeted by 100 bows from our new friends, their chanting echoing throughout the cave, a chanting that quickly devolved into chaos as each one of the hooded figures attempted to call out to us welcomely in the same bizarre dialect. That is, before one of them interrupted. "Silence!" a man screamed from the other end of the platform as an immediate hush fell over the cave. "You'll have to excuse them," he called out to us from the head of the enormous table. "They haven't seen an outsider in months and get excited easily. Oh, and as you may have noticed, they speak a different tongue." A relatively unimposing man, our host, as I referred to him, had a short stature and a freshly trimmed moustache that nearly curled up to his wire-framed spectacles. Even more odd, he was wearing a vest and a sweatshirt that each looked as if they were freshly purchased or freshly washed, or both. "Now, come, please, join us for dinner." By the looks of what he was wearing and the words he was speaking, I assumed that he too must have been an outsider like us at one point in time. Trevor simply looked over at me, not knowing how to reply. "Thank you," I yelled back to the man from the foot of the bridge as I spotted one of the hooded figures gesturing for us to take a seat next to the host. We did as they asked. "George," the man introduced himself with a smile, extending his hand, before Trevor and I each shook it politely. Trevor. Ryan. Pleasure to meet you, gentlemen. Now, before we begin, any allergies or dietary restrictions? He was completely serious. No, Trevor replied. Not that I know of, I added. Splendid, he called out, before yelling in the direction of the bridge. May the feast begin. Under the table, I gripped my dusty jeans in fear, anticipating the worst, as Trevor turned and looked at me, his own hands clearly shaking. But then, dozens of hooded men came running across the bridge, each carrying a basket of food, and emptied its contents onto the plates that had been preemptively set out across the table. Relieved to discover that it was an actual feast, I relaxed my posture. I looked over at one of the men sitting across from me, most of his face still concealed by his hood as he stripped the meat from a chicken leg, and then over at Trevor, who was already devouring one of his own. When in Rome, I thought to myself, grabbing an apple from the basket of fruit and ravenously chomping into it. I must say, there are no words that can quite describe that very first bite of food after you've been starving in the wilderness for days. I would ask what brings you here, but I have a feeling I know the answer, George continued. Lost in the mountains, but look at you now. Trevor and I both feigned smiles, too preoccupied with satiating our weary bodies. Thank you, I mumbled, still chewing. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Trevor added, before placing his now completely bare chicken bone onto his plate and casually asking, If you don't mind, sir, what is it exactly you guys do down here? Our host paused for a moment before smiling again. Why, I thought you'd never ask. He replied with a smile, before pointing at the hooded men. Well, you see, they live here, and I'm but a frequent visitor of sorts. To what end? I asked, completely serious. He simply looked at me and burst out laughing. To what end? To what end? That's a good one. That's a really good one. To what end? Trevor and I looked at each other, confused. Well, I'll show you, he said before yelling something out in the bizarre dialect. Suddenly, the injured man that we had saved, who was sitting at the other end of the table, immediately stopped eating, stood up from the table and limped over to us. Kill them, George commanded calmly, pointing at Trevor and I, as he bit off a piece of chicken from a bone, without even bothering to make eye contact with the hooded figure. We both laughed nervously, assuming he was kidding. George stopped eating. I said, kill them, he called out, raising his voice. He was not kidding. Our host then proceeded to hop up from his chair and walked over to the injured man, who was just standing there, staring at us, conflicted about what to do. We had, after all, found him in the darkness and carried him to safety. The cave went silent. Seriously? George yelled as he began to pace around the rocky island. I feed you, I build the trap for you, I bring them here after months of hard work rearranging the signposts, and you hesitate? You dare defy me? You ungrateful idiots! When I first found you, you had only 2 of the men needed to complete your journey, and now the last 2 sit before you, and you hesitate? We had a deal. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Kill them and bring me the items as we agreed, or else. Wait, what the hell? I thought to myself, unable to process all the details from this lengthy monologue in the moment. Everyone looked over at the injured man, who was staring at George, his eyes wide with fear. He then turned back to Trevor and myself, then back to the host, and then back to us again, before, suddenly, Trevor catapulted from his seat and grabbed me by the collar. "Run!" he screamed before darting off into the direction of the nearest tunnel. A sentiment that I couldn't have agreed with more. We had made it to about the bridge, unpursued, the hooded men simply sitting there in silence, when suddenly, all 100 or so of them, in unison, sprang from their chairs and started chasing after us, as they screamed and wailed. "Go ahead, I'll catch up," Trevor yelled, letting me by as I ran into one of the passages. But soon I'd learned that he had no intentions of catching up, as he instead ran into a different tunnel, leading the men away from me. "Trevor!" I called out. "Save yourself," he called back. And then, he was gone. A few minutes later, I arrived at the room, not a hooded figure in sight, and stopped for a moment to catch my breath, hunched over and hyperventilating. He saved me, I thought to myself. I gotta get out of here and bring help. I have to save Trevor. When I finally stood up to survey my surroundings, I couldn't believe my eyes. Just a few steps away was a giant pit, rigged with 1,000 spears at its bottom, and the other side of it, piled up on what looked like a shrine of some sort, was a mound of antique items, including watches and jewelry. The items, I thought to myself. Those must be the items he's after. But I didn't have time to revel in the beauty of the treasure, and took off down another passage. Eventually, I found myself in a chamber, flooded with light that was pouring down from the ceiling. That's no torchlight. Spotting a ladder that was bolted to the rocky wall on the far side of the room, I hopped up onto the rusty old thing and crawled my way up to the ceiling, the light growing brighter and brighter with every rung that I climbed. Reaching the top, I lifted myself through a hole in the ceiling of the chamber, feeling around for stable ground, and hopped onto what felt like a rocky ledge. That's when I learned for certain that the light that had been blinding me. Squinting, I scanned the area, only to find that I was standing atop the very summit of the mountain itself, its flat surface stretching out endlessly in all directions. From its vantage point, I looked down at the very terrain Trevor and I had gotten lost in, the very land that had led us here, and spotted where we had set out on our journey. A tiny beacon of hope in a sea of wilderness. And that's when my eyes finally adjusted and I saw it. An object so out of place, so wondrous and so unbelievable that it made an elevator in the mountains look comparatively commonplace. There, perched on the summit, its pieces scattered across the rocky landscape, lay the ancient remains of an early 20th century plane, long crashed and long lost to time. And in the distance, on the multiple end of the mountain's peak, was its cabin area, still intact, save for a missing wall that rendered it like a diorama, its seats exposed to the elements. I walked over to inspect it more closely, and was immediately met with a gruesome sight. Sitting there, upright in all but 2 of its 10 seats, were the rotted remains of 8 poor souls. But it was obvious from their appearance that these were not the aircraft's original passengers. No, These people had died much more recently, clearly victims of the mountain dwellers, sacrificed for reasons unknown, and laid to rest in the plain, forever. And as for the two unoccupied seats, or should I say, graves, it suddenly became glaringly apparent that they were where Trevor and I would have ended up, should the hooded figures have caught us. Trevor. My mind returned to my friend, wondering what may have happened to him, and fearing the worst. I wrestled with the idea of heading back to find him, but knew that there were way too many of them to put up a fighting chance, and opted for seeking help in the harsh wilderness over returning to the cave. As I climbed down the side of the mountain, I lost my footing and twisted my ankle, but I quickly regained my grip and powered on in pain, certain that if the mountain dwellers somehow caught up to me, I'd end up in the aircraft. After reaching the mountain's base, I spent the entirety of the day hobbling through the foothills of the direction we came from, much too traumatized and much too determined to find help, to celebrate my escape, and eventually passed out from exhaustion. The next day, my prayers were answered. Beep. Headquarters, are you there? Beep. Waking up to the sound of a walkie-talkie, I opened my eyes to find a park ranger staring down at me with a smile. Beep. I found one, he yelled excitedly into his radio. I repeat, I found one. Beep. I simply mumbled, Trevor, before passing out again. A few days later, after recovering in a hospital and recounting what happened to the police, I led them back into the mountain. Back through the elevator, down the passage, over the bridge, and to the rocky platform where the feast had been held. But this time, no one had shown up for dinner. The cave was just empty. I remember thinking, this is what arriving at Roanoke must have felt like. I then proceeded to lead the cops down the passage where Trevor had taken, but again was met with disappointment. We found nothing but a rocky dead end. And so I finally brought them back to the cave, and instead down the passage that I had taken to the room with the giant pit. Well, screw me, one of the officers said, staring down into it. I walked up beside him and looked down. Sure enough, there they were, all 100 or so hooded men lying at the bottom, impaled on the spikes, the antique items scattered all around them. Kid wasn't lying, the officer continued, as another threw up all over the rocky floor. But little did they know that they hadn't seen the worst of it yet. It wasn't until I took them up the ladder, onto the mountain's summit, and over to the archaic plain, where they saw the most disgusting sight of all. A cabin of dead, all seats now full, the last two of which now occupied by my best friend, Trevor, and a man who would eventually be identified as wealthy archaeologist George Henderson, betrayed and left treasureless in the aircraft by the very individuals he once presided over. I'd later learned that the people of the mountain were actually the descendants of the survivors of that very plain, who, after establishing a civilization for themselves in the cave below its crash site, built a new language and mythology for themselves. A mythology that required the sacrifice of 10 individuals before they could be reunited with their ill-fated ancestors in the afterlife.